Hey, it's Abby from the Homeschool with Moxie podcast. This is episode 254, and be sure to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. You can find the show notes at 4onemore.com/254. Today's episode is about strengthening your child's foundation in faith, and our guest is Christian Horstmann. He is the host of the Family Discipleship podcast, and also his site is christianfamilyreformation.com. So we decided to talk about this topic because of our culture and our kids needing to have a Christian worldview to be able to navigate the culture that they're in. We know that doubts are a big deal, especially when you get to the teenage years. There are contradictory messages they're hearing from the culture about the authority of the Bible. So listen in on this conversation I had with Christian Horstmann about practical ways you can encourage your children and strengthen their foundation in the Word. We're going to talk about where doubts originate. We're going to talk about the Bible and apologetics, and even a little bit about biblical literacy. So listen in on this conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, Christian, it's so good to have you today on the Homeschool with Moxie podcast. So let's start with having you introduce yourself to my audience.
Yeah, hey there. Pleasure to be here. I'm a homeschool grad, so I'm not a homeschool parent yet. One day, Lord willing, I will be. Um, but yeah, I have a website and podcast of my own where I just try to share encouragement and inspiration for Christian homeschool families, kind of from the homeschool graduates perspective. There's a lot of information and resources out there from parents' perspective, which is awesome, and I think it's grown a lot over the last few years, which is wonderful. But just kind of a different perspective on the topic and the field. So that's kind of where I'm at, and yeah, pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. Yeah, I did take a look at your website too. I thought you must be a homeschool grad because I thought, why do you want to talk to homeschool moms? Why are you passionate about this topic? So, we are going to talk today about giving kids that strong biblical foundation so they can evaluate, like, the culture is throwing so much at kids. I mean, it has changed so much in 10 years, hasn't it? And even 20 years. It's crazy how fast things are getting worse. It doesn't seem
Uh,
like it was this fast before. It just seems like
yeah.
such a super fast pace. But I thought, like, why are you passionate about this? Because it must have been something about your upbringing as a homeschool student and then coming from that perspective. So just can you dive into a little bit more about, like, why this topic and why you as a homeschool grad is this really important to you?
Yeah. Well, I think I didn't maybe necessarily realize this as much like when I was in school. But after I graduated and kind of, I don't know, seen a little bit more of the world, maybe, so to speak, it's like I'm really, really thankful for the upbringing I've had. I'm glad I was homeschooled. And, so sometimes I think, us students, we take that for granted sometimes. But then when, like I said, when you look out at the world, you kind of get a bigger picture of the way things are out there. It's not a pretty picture, right? It's like I just see, so many, families, broken families and just, tragic things going on all over the world. And I think we can trace a lot of that. There's things going on politically in the church, as a nation, internationally. But I really think that a lot of problems can be traced back to the way the families are. Churches are nothing but a collection of, individuals and families, primarily families most of the time. But the same thing with, a nation or government. A nation is a collection of individuals and families. So I think it's really important to strengthen and encourage the family because the churches and the nation are only going to be as good as the families are. And it's, that's the way God set our society up to be. He created the family unit, and no wonder then that the devil wants to attack it. So that's why I'm passionate about it. Like I said, I didn't necessarily understand that big picture perspective when I was growing up, but it's something I've definitely seen now. I've kind of seen both ends of the spectrum, where you look at a situation or a family, it's like, what went wrong here, right? It's like, this is a train wreck, what happened? And then on the other side of the spectrum too, where it's, you can, total 180 contrast, where it's like, this is a, godly Christian family. You love being around them. You love seeing the impact that they're having on the culture and the church, for the glory of Christ. And, that's the way I would like all of our homes and families to be leaning in that direction instead of the train wreck.
Yep. So where do you see some of the main sources of like this doubt and skepticism that young adults, teens, everyone's encountering? Where do you see that coming from?
Yeah. Well, hate to put it this way, but pretty much almost everywhere, right?
Mhm.
But there are some sources that are a little bit more so than others. A lot of it comes through, I think, the entertainment that our culture's big into. Movies, music. For families that aren't homeschoolers, huge one is through the government school system. But then there's friend groups and peers, which is big pressure, I'm sure, as I'm sure you know. And then like, social media doesn't help. That's something that I never really battled with growing up. So it's like, one of those big changes, like, man, I never even thought of this, when I was, 6 years old. But we're in the age of tech now. So, that has not helped at all, as far as, strengthening and encouraging our next generation of young people. And I wouldn't say necessarily that all those things are causes per se of doubt, right? Um, but I think the worldview and the lifestyle that a lot of them promote are very anti-biblical. So I don't think you can say um, you know all friend groups, our children's friends groups are going to cause that. It's not necessarily a cause and effect reaction. But when you consider the worldview that's promoted, the lifestyle is promoted in a lot of these things, technology and entertainment, music, movies, all that kind of stuff. I think it leads our children to question more. Um, and again, not that it's necessarily a wrong thing to have questions. And I think that's something we need to make sure our children understand too. Um, so it's not wrong to ask questions, but we're opening the door wider for questions of doubt and skepticism, if we're not careful with what we fill our children's time with. Does that make
Mhm.
sense?
Mhm. Yeah. My husband and I were just talking about how our childhoods and teenage years and young adult years were so different because we didn't have any social media. And I said, "Oh, I miss that world." And
Mhm.
it's hard because as an adult, you kind of have to be plugged in when you're doing a podcast, or whatever. You have to be on social media, but it's kind of
Right.
annoying. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't like this, but it is the world
Mhm.
we're in. So our kids have to learn to navigate it, especially when they become adults. They're probably going to need to be on there for different reasons, and it's
Mhm.
just we have to help them learn to navigate it. So talk about
Right.
pop culture. That's a really hard one too, because pop culture often contradicts a biblical worldview, and that's a huge impact on a lot of kids and teenagers.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, music, movies, entertainment, I'd say that falls into a big, it's kind of maybe a subset of that. But yeah, and in what way does, you ask like what way does it contradict the biblical worldview? And again, sounds really overly general, but pretty much in every way possible.
Mhm.
But especially, I think it promotes very much a self-centered, humanistic philosophy, that we're filling our kids' minds with. That's the way they're going to look at life. So, basically just a love of self, promotes a wrong view of the purpose and meaning of life. Because when you think about it, there's only two worldviews out there. We think of all these religions, all these, systems of thought and everything. When you think about it, there's really only two, right? And this is what Jesus says, it's either, his way or not his way, right? It's either Christ or Satan. It's either, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of the world. So all those other stuff would fit into the latter if it's not part of the kingdom of Christ. And so that's how you boil it down. And when you think of it that way, it's really very simple. So like I said, wrong view of the purpose and meaning of life. When you have that humanistic, self-centered worldview, no wonder we see half the things that are going on out in the world.
Mhm.
And it's like, it just makes sense in that worldview. And so we're scratching our heads and they're thinking, like, how could somebody think that way? Well, I'll tell you how they think that way because that's how they've been fed from the culture, from school, and everywhere else. Big part of it is evolutionary teaching. Just the way we think and it affects the way we live our life. And just so a lot of these things they just really promote a lot of flagrant sin. Pop culture tends to make it look fun or exciting or popular, especially when it's endorsed by big names, Hollywood. Hope I don't step on any toes, Taylor Swift. So it's really destructive, and it never presents. Sin never presents itself as the destruction that it really is. So you think about it. We have all these big name people that are openly promoting a flagrantly sinful lifestyle, but then they're so kind or generous or so successful, and then it's like your children are saying you're going to be sitting here thinking like, well, what's the connection here if this person is so well off and so successful and so happy, then I want to live like them, right? If that lifestyle brings, happiness, then, why not, right? So it's like, that's why it's so important. Like I said, that we, kind of guard what our children's mind and time is filled up with, because, it will have an effect.
Hmm. So, how would you define worldview? Because we're using this word, I always forget to define stuff because I think everyone knows
Yeah.
what it means. We just jumped into the conversation, but
Yeah.
what do you mean when you're talking about worldview? How do you define that?
Yeah, what's the way that we view all of life, right? I mean, it's like I said, either you view it from the lens of scripture, I try to present more of a biblical worldview and live according to a biblical worldview. And so that's going to shape the way I think about things. It's going to shape the way I live. It's going to shape, the choices I make. It's going to shape, the decisions of things I do. It's going to affect, the way I spend my time, the way I spend, my leisure time, what I choose to do for a career or work. So it's just a framework that we view all of life, and everything flows through that lens. And so that's why I'm saying if we have that biblical worldview, then our thoughts and actions are going to be governed and guided in one direction. Whereas if it's a humanistic, evolutionary, self-centered worldview, um, it's self-centered and self-focused. And like I said, that's where everything else would fall in.
Mhm.
And, so everything else is just a subset of that one. But if we have that perspective, no wonder we have all these sin problems, and we have addictions, and we have, all kinds of terrible stuff going on, because it's not centered on Christ and we're not living for his glory.
Yeah, and it's funny, some people like to think they're very neutral. Like they're like, I'm not this or
Yes.
that, but you really are one or the other. And it does
Oh,
come
yes.
down to where's your authority, right? Where are you gaining? Where's the authority for your worldview? So talk to us about
Right.
what children need to grasp when we're talking about worldview and the authority of the Bible. What do you see there?
Right. Right. Well, like you just said, if in a biblical worldview, the Bible is the authority of that worldview. It's not about what we want or what, culture says or society says or celebrity says. It comes down to, the Bible is the final authority in all matters of life. And so, our children need to understand that growing up. They need to be able to recognize that the Bible is what it says it is. They need to, we as parents need to, show them and educate them on why it's different, from other, supposed holy books. Why is it different than the Quran? Why is it different, from all the other, world religions out there? They need to understand, it is in fact the true word of God, and that like I said, that is the final authority. And when we build that worldview off that foundation, like that's what's going to shape, their life and, our life, because hopefully we're living that out too, right? um, but also, even more importantly than that, sometimes I think, kind of get, I don't know, distracted is the right word. But it's important to understand the Bible is the foundation of our life. But also, I think we also need to make sure our children understand, the Bible is God's um, love letter to them. It's not just, the Bible is not just teaching us how to live, right? It shows us, the big picture of why we're here in the first place. And we'll kind of get to this in a minute. Um, but what happened and what's wrong with the world and how it can be made right, how it can be fixed, because there are a lot of terrible things that go on, and they need to understand, the message of the Bible is the gospel. It's not just, guiding my thoughts and my actions to live a certain way, because if that's all it is, we've kind of missed the boat, right? We've kind of missed the whole point, of what, the Bible's message is all about. And the Bible's message is the gospel. And so, I think it's really important that we make sure that our children understand that, they understand, the gospel message in the Bible. But then, it does tie back to, that does have to be built on the foundation as well. So I think they're kind of interconnected. The Bible is the authority that shapes the way we live, the way we think, and the way we act. But it's more than that, and they kind of have to go side by side.
Mhm. I'm glad you mentioned earlier, like it's okay to ask questions because kids naturally they want to ask. And I think we need to be open to that because if
Mhm.
you're asking questions, you want thoughtful discussion. I think people need to realize like that's a good thing too. Like the youth pastor, the pastors need to be open to that. My husband is pastor and he engages with skeptics all the time, doubters, people in the
Yeah.
community, people in our church. And I think though, as parents, if we don't allow our kids to ask questions, because sometimes we're afraid we don't know the answer. So we shut them down. Nope, don't ask that. Just take my
Right.
word for it. But then we're sending the message that the biblical worldview is shallow or fragile or can't handle it, right? But it
Mhm.
can. So
Oh,
when we're
yes.
thinking of especially teens, because they're the ones really wrestling with stuff. What questions do you think teens really should wrestle with? Because that's actually a healthy thing for them to work through it, not just accept it. Because when they do, then they become adults and then they sometimes just kind of abandon the faith at all because they've never really wrestled with those things on their own, right?
Right, right. And then, then they'll ask them to, the wrong people and they'll get the wrong
Mhm.
answers, right? And they're
That's
like,
true
oh, well,
too.
they
Yeah.
have answers for this over here. Well, my
Mhm.
pastor or whatever never had answers for that. But, and
Yes.
yeah, and you said, teens in particular, I do agree with you. A lot of times it's when it comes out, maybe earlier, maybe later. But pretty much every human being, there's four questions I'll kind of walk through here. And they may not always take the same form as this, verbatim. But basically, when you boil down most of your children's hard questions about, life and the meaning of life and everything like that, basically, I think you can pretty much summarize them in four main categories. And the way, like you said, the way these questions are answered, it's going to affect their worldview. It's going to have a profound impact on that. And and when that worldview is shaped, then it's going to shape the way that they view others, the way they treat others, and the way they live the rest of their life. So the four questions, like I said, just kind of summary. Who am I, right? Why am I here? Why is the world messed up? And what can be done to fix it? And so I kind of alluded to that a minute ago. Like I said, these are huge fundamental questions. And, I think, every human being, wrestles with these, whether they vocalize them or whether they, admit that they're wrestling with them. Some people kind of put on that I've got it all together attitude, right? And they're like, you wouldn't think that, they're wrestling with this, but everyone wrestles with these. And so kind of walk through, the way that both worldviews, biblical worldview and a humanist worldview answer those. So like first one, who am I? Right. Well, the Bible teaches you are made in the image of God. You have a special purpose. You're not, contrary to evolutionary worldview, you're not evolved from pond scum, billions and billions of years ago, because in that worldview, what what real value is there in human life then, right? If you're just evolved from, pond scum billions of years ago, you're just a random chemical accident. And so, it kind of impacts the way we answer the next question, why am I here? Or, you might rephrase that, what is the meaning of life, right? So why are we here? Well, according to the Bible, we've been created in the image of God and God wants to have a relationship with us and he wants us to give him glory. In a humanist worldview, why am I here? Well, I'm here to basically consume as much as I can get and enjoy life while it lasts and, you know, do whatever it takes to come out on top and get whatever I want as long as it lasts, right? And so, this is where I'm saying the way you answer that question, that's going to have an effect on the way you treat other people, right? If you're just a random chemical mistake and I'm just a random chemical mistake and I happen to be bigger and stronger than you and I want what you have, why is it wrong? You tell me why it's wrong. If it's, we're just chemical accident. Whereas, in the biblical worldview, why is that wrong? It's wrong because human beings are made in the image of God and we're made to give him glory and not, to have a relationship with him and to, show love and kindness to our fellow human beings. Um, and then there's the question, why is this world messed up? Basically what happened. It doesn't take an Albert Einstein to figure out the world's not a happy place a lot of the time. There's a lot of sickness, pain, suffering, crime, all kinds of terrible stuff that goes on every day. So why? And this question is often vocalized. Why would a loving God allow things like that, right? Well, biblical worldview, it's not God's fault. It's our fault because we sinned and rebelled. We chose to sin and rebel against Him. In an evolutionary humanistic worldview, though, why is the world messed up? You don't really have an answer for that. Get over it. It's always been that way. That's how we got here is by beating and killing and coming out on top, whatever it takes. So, what do you mean? Why is the world messed up? It's not. This is normal. Get over it. Get on with life, right? And people don't think about it. It sounds so cruel and hard, and most people wouldn't answer that question that way. But if you think about it, that's the only way you can logically answer that question in a humanistic worldview. So yeah, no wonder we have despair and disappointment and unhappiness. But that's where the fourth question comes in because the biblical worldview has another answer that the other one doesn't, and that is the answer to the question, what can be done to be fixed, or what can be done to fix it. The world's messed up, but is there hope? Is there a solution? And in the biblical worldview, we have that solution. We have that answer. God sent His Son Jesus Christ to die for our sins and to restore us to a reconciled place reconciled relationship with the Father. And so, in light of that, we have hope while we live. We have purpose while we live because we're living for His glory. And then we have the assurance that when we die, we're gonna, if we believe in Him, we'll be taken to His heavenly kingdom to live and enjoy Him forever. Um, Evolutionary humanistic worldview, though, you can't answer that. What are you going to happen? What's going to happen when you die? You're dead. You're done. You go back to the ground where you came from, and that's it. And so, the way, hopefully, just walking through those really, quickly like that, you can see they're diametrically opposite. If someone is steeped and ingrained in that humanistic worldview, no wonder, they act the way they do. No wonder they think the way they do. No wonder, we have all these issues, crime and, hatred and, suicide and things like that. But in the biblical worldview, there's hope and there's an answer for those problems. There's an answer for those questions. And that's where it kind of comes down to what I said a minute ago, that's what our children need to understand about the Bible is it's not just, oh, this is telling us how to live and we have to do it just because it says to. No, God wants a relationship with us. And, sometimes I think, especially in the homeschool circles, and I'm not saying everywhere by any means, but sometimes I think there's kind of this tendency to, we've pulled our children out of public school, or, maybe we've done it from day one, but we kind of just view it as an academic thing. And the way I see homeschooling is it's not, like you said, it's not neutral. Academics are not neutral. If, our academics as homeschoolers is not for the purpose of, growing our children's relationship with the Lord, then it's, beside the point. We're not doing a whole lot better than the government schools are doing. So, that really, I think, has to be an essential part of it. And, like I said, not to, condemn anyone or anything like that, but I just think sometimes it's something we tend to overlook, especially if it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction from the way, the school system works, or, we might have pulled our kids out because, we rightfully so don't like something they're doing. But we've got to remember that it's not just, pulling our kids out of school and bringing them home and doing the same thing at our kitchen table. No, the reason we do academics and the reason we homeschool is to grow our children's relationship with Christ. And that's only possible in the biblical worldview. And so, again, it's not neutral. It's, you're either one or the other. So,
So along those lines of talking about like academics aren't in this vacuum, like the Christian biblical worldview is infusing everything. So let's talk about, I love this topic, biblical literacy, because I talk about this a lot also. And that's why we've done inductive Bible studies for the homeschool market, because it's like nothing substitutes for actually being in the word and learning to read it. So how would you define biblical literacy and why is that important as a goal for growing our kids?
right. Well, biblical literacy, I think you could simply define it as being very familiar with the Bible, but like I said, again, with the caveat, not just knowing it in the head, but for the purpose of, growing that relationship with God in our heart. So, not to just memorize all the verses or, check it off our to-do list that we've read it every day. But it's important because, as, parents, we won't always be there for our children to analyze, help them analyze the ideas and the culture. And so that's why it's so important to, give them that foundation while they're young, get them, used to it, from, hopefully from as early as they can remember, right? From the time they're a baby. Because we want them to get used to that foundation, so that when they're older and adults, and we may not even be here anymore, they're going to, it's going to be their default mode, right? They're automatically going to turn to that, hopefully, if they've had that strong foundation and gotten that foundation built as they were growing up, and so it's just like second nature to them. Why would they go anywhere else, for these answers or for help when they need it? And I think it's important too. We have to remember, kind of like you said, it's not just an empty vacuum. Our children's minds are not empty vacuums. They're going to get their ideas from somewhere. They're going to get answers to these questions from somewhere. And that's why I said a minute ago, it's important to do that while they're young too, because when they do go out into the world, if they don't have the answers, from a solid Christian perspective, someone else is going to answer them for them. And it's not going to be, if that person isn't steeped in a biblical worldview themselves, then they're not going to give the right answers. So, our children are going to get their ideas. They're going to get them from somewhere. So I just think, why should we allow them to get them from the world? Why should we allow, people like, Hollywood stars and people like that to influence the way our children think? When we have something so much better, so much more superior, and something that's so much more fulfilling. So why would we give them, the cheap imitations, of, so, like I said, supposed happiness that, these worldly celebrities have, or, doesn't just have to be them. It could be, their friend next door, right? That, they perceive as, being happier in the ways of the world or the ways of sin. So why should we allow them to think that way when we have something that's so much more fulfilling to fill their mind with? And again, I tie this back to, like I said a minute ago, I said several times, it's not just growing biblical knowledge, it's growing it for the sake of increasing and growing our relationship with God. So, the Bible, being literate in the Bible, very, familiar with the Bible, it's important because without that, not only do you have, no way to answer those big questions I mentioned a minute ago, but you have no gospel and you have no consistent, answer for the problems you have. You have no answer for the sin problem. You have no hope that anything is ever going to be better. It's just going to be, the way it is. Get over it, right? So I think that's why it's very, very important. Um, Parents make sure their children are familiar with the Bible and not just internalizing it, but hopefully hiding it in their heart and learning to appreciate and value it for what it really is.
So let's finish up our time by talking about apologetics because this is an
Yeah.
interesting thing, especially, I mean, you can do this with young kids too on their level, but I mean, especially the teens, once
Mhm.
again, they really want to know like the why to everything and why do we believe this and why is this
Mhm.
true? So talk about apologetics, why it's important to instruct our teens in it, especially when we talk about even like faith and science, which tends to be a hang up for a lot of people, being able to get those two things in their minds to to what's the word? I don't know, coexist. Like, can we believe,
Right.
still have faith and,
Right.
science can still be, we can still trust science. I don't know, whatever. Well, how does that all work
Right.
with apologetics?
Right. Yeah. How do you, some people have this idea that like, if you're a Christian, you can't, believe in science. And again, this is, mentioned this a minute ago, this is where you have to define your terms, right?
Hmm.
So what exactly do we mean by science? Because there's two kinds of science. There's historical science and there's observational science. And a lot of people, they blur that line and they think, oh, well, if you believe that, outdated Bible, then you can't, believe in science. And what they're thinking of is, technology, science that's, put man on the moon, that's built cell phones, we built 747 jets. Um, that's usually what they're referring to. And that's, really it's a ridiculous comparison. It's,
Hmm.
very outdated if you really go and research it. You can be a wonderful Christian and, believe in science. That's not an issue, but that's observational science that, is tangible. We can work on it and repeat it and everything else. What Where the line gets blurred, though, is when you come to historical science, and that's, basically, obviously everything happened before us, right? But specifically, like in the beginning, and that's where the Bible comes in because it's the eyewitness account of someone who was there. And so, remember I was telling you, those two origin stories, how do we get here? Why are we here? Um, though the way we answer those questions and define those, that's going to affect our view of science. That, like I said, the evolutionary worldview has really creeped in to a lot of the way we think, and so we've kind of blurred that line. And so, true science, you have to remember this: true science is always going to agree with, and it's going to support the Bible. There's never going to be a contradiction. God's world is always going to agree with God's word when it's understood in the proper biblical worldview and framework. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Because like I said, a lot of people tend to blur that distinction, and they're like, well, uh, um, you know, if you have a biblical worldview, you can absolutely believe in science.
Hmm.
It's not, an outdated thing that, makes us stuck back in, 300 years ago or whatever. Um, so yeah, we just always have to keep that in mind. God's world. I like that saying in particular. God's world is always going to agree with God's word when it's understood in biblical framework.
So, what are the resources you recommend for apologetics?
Yeah, so there are thankfully some really great ones out there, and we were just talking, kind of some of the things over the last 10, 20 years that have gotten worse. Thankfully, by God's grace, there are things that have gotten better too, and I would say, that's a nice thing. There are definitely way more resources and things out there, especially for Christian homeschoolers than there were 10, 20, 30,
Hmm.
40 years ago. So I don't know. A couple of my favorites probably would be I really like Answers in Genesis Ministries. You might know him from the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, which
Hmm.
highly recommend if you're ever able to visit there. But especially kind of piggybacking on the topic of science in particular, because they do a really good job of explaining.
Hmm.
Um, how you can understand science from a biblical worldview and how it doesn't conflict with the Bible. And they have a lot of wonderful children's resources, and just really good about explaining how the Bible's true from the very first verse. And kind of like what I've said here, it makes sense when you understand that framework. It makes sense of everything else in the world around us. Um, Another resource. that I like is a website by Israel Wayne called ChristianWorldview.net. He has a lot of great articles and just on a wide range of apologetics type topics. So that's a good resource to check out. And also Generations Ministries, I really like. They're not just apologetics focused. They have a lot of like homeschool curriculum and stuff like that. But I love how their curriculum, their apologetics books, and all the resources are very focused on promoting that biblical worldview. Because apologetics and that worldview, they're combined. Again, the way the worldview you have is going to affect the way you answer those questions. And sometimes we tend to think of apologetics as just a Christian thing. But the world has apologetics too. The world, yeah, that's what I'm saying. The world has these answers or has answers, or they try to have answers because they don't really answer the heart of the questions.
Mhm.
But they try to have answers and they try to, have, defenses and answers for these questions that people have. But, when you examine them, they're not fulfilling, they're not satisfying, and they don't really answer the question because they can't, because it doesn't make sense in their worldview. And I could go on and on about that, but but those are probably some of my favorites that I would definitely turn to on a regular basis if you're looking for good sources.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. And
yeah,
we will link to those in the show notes too. We've
yeah,
used Generations Homeschool, and I know they're newer,
yeah,
so I've only used them for my
yes,
youngest. And
yes,
until I looked, I had never seen so much of the Christian worldview infused into the curriculum rather than
yeah,
tacked on a verse here, tack on,
yes, yeah. That's a
it
big
was
thing. Yeah,
very much so an infused kind of curriculum
yeah,
with the Christian
yeah.
worldview, right?
Yeah,
So
and I love that too. Yeah, unfortunately, when I was in school, that like I said,
yeah,
it is relatively newer, but
exactly.
praise God, that's definitely something that I
Yeah,
think there's a much needed market for. And you're right, it's
yeah.
more than just slapping a Bible verse on the bottom of your textbook. It's
Right.
it's way more than
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so
And
yeah,
maybe that's what turned off some of the kids that grew up in homeschool because it felt like it was tacked on. It didn't feel like it was
yeah,
cohesive and, infused and everything. So that's a challenge for parents. Don't just tack it on as something extra, right? It's really infused in everything. So, well, we will link to your website and your podcast
yeah.
so people can find you. Go ahead
Thank
and
you.
mention one more time where people can find you online. And of course, we'll link to it all in the
Yeah.
show notes.
Yeah, I have two websites, one for my podcast specifically, and that is familydiscipleshippodcast.net. So you can go there. It's got all the episodes on there. Try to publish one every week with some really great guests and speakers there. But also you can also check out christianfamilyreformation.com. And that's more my just general site where I try to publish, share things, resources and articles and just things that God lays on my heart from time to time. So I try to keep up with that on a regular basis. So, sometimes there's a little bit more of a gap than others, but I, try to be a little bit, as consistent as I can be on sharing things through there. So hopefully it's a blessing to your family. So both of those.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Christian. Appreciate the conversation.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation I just had with Christian Horstmann. Be sure to check out the show notes at 411more.com/254. You can follow Christian on the Family Discipleship Podcast or on his site at ChristianFamilyReformation.com. Thanks for joining us today. And in the meantime, happy homeschooling.